Hello and welcome to another episode of Finders Keepers, the podcast where we help you find the best keepers for your keeper and dynasty leagues. I'm your host Jordox, and can you believe it? Round one has come and gone. And wasn't it a round of ups and downs in a fantasy sense and for the league itself? We had some cracking, close games, but also a heap of blowouts as sides fought it out in all extremes of weather, from the incredible heat to the massive rainpour we saw across the country. But the best part of the whole weekend was that we got a whole weekend of footy. 9 games, plenty to go through, and I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into it in this, what is the first in-season episode of Finders Keepers. So the way the pod's going to run for in-season is essentially going to be broken up into 3 segments. The first being role changes, where I discuss any players I've noticed with a notable role change on the weekend. The player himself may not be relevant, but the role change could have a knock-on effect on other fantasy relevant players. And of course, these role changes could just be temporary, giving the player some short-term value, or they could be long-term changes, offering the potential to add dual position status to the player. Then I'll be going through my top waiver wire pickups for the week, and really in a keeper league and single season draft for that matter. You know, there's a lot of emphasis on the draft at the start of the year, quite rightfully, but really your team's success, I think, is determined by how well you play the waiver wires and also how diligent you are in assessing the free agency and the player pool of what's available. Because the best players in your team are probably not going to come from the redraft. They're going to come from the guys you pick up along the way. And then the last segment will be trade talk. So last week on the pod, I asked you to send in your best trades, worst trades, anything to do with trades, and I read them out and reviewed them on the pod, and it was good fun. So I'm asking you to do that every week. Anytime you get a trade offer or you're thinking of putting an offer to a mate in your league, send it through and I'll read it out on the pod and I'll review it right here. And we'll also extend it to any sort of questions or thoughts you might have on keeper leagues. So do make sure you send those questions in. Find us on X at FindKeepAFL. So let's start with this week's role changes. Being round one, there's always going to be a whole bunch. Now, some of these will be role changes that we saw coming because of the preseason and we got a bit of a taste of it. And then sometimes they're just out of the blue and not expected. So I'll start with Thursday night, and this was a role change that we did expect, and that's Jack Silvani, who made his long-awaited return to the game after a significant period of time out due to injury. Over his career, Silvani has been a forward. He's been probably a high half forward that's come up the ground. He's been a backup ruckman, which was always odd, but hey, those extra hit-outs were handy for his score build. But this year he was training with the defenders, and we saw that on Thursday night. Played in the back line, not like a loose sort of quarterback role, which would have been really nice. And he's looked pretty good, scored quite nicely, has a fantasy game in him, which we've known. One thing to note, though, he was swung forward in the last quarter, so I wouldn't be too comfortable with him, relying on him as a defender. I think Carlton are going to move him around sort of as games go, and it's kind of hard to get any sort of read on Carlton themselves from Thursday night. Obviously a disastrous result, coughing up that big lead and losing to the Tigers. So he's a watch for me. See where he goes this week against the Hawks. I think if he's playing off half back or in that back six, I think he's going to be pretty handy, obviously with the forward status. So a bit of an expected one to kick us off. And another one that was very much expected due to the preseason was Sam De Koning at Geelong. Currently with defender status. We saw De Koning play in the ruck for a handful of games last year, and whilst his scoring was up and down, it it was promising. But he did look out of his element as a ruck. And this pre-season he was training as a ruck, so I was really interested to see how he looked in the role. And on the weekend, I thought he looked brilliant. Obviously, career high score in fantasy, career high disposals, he had 25. But I really thought his ruck craft looked pretty good too. Obviously, he was up against Reedy and Luke Jackson at Freo, so he'll come up against harder rucks in the future. But I don't know, just judging him on the one game, from what I saw, he looked like he's gonna be pretty good in that position. The other interesting thing was he dominated the CBAs, so he took most of the centre bounce ruck attendances, but around the ground it was more of a split between him, Blitzarves and Shannon Neal. So I guess what they're probably doing with him is starting him in the ruck and letting him float around the ground and intercept, because that still is his greatest strength as a defender, his intercept marking, reading the play. So if we get a ruckman who starts in the middle and then moves to like an intercepting role as well, I don't know, it's quite unique, and I think he's going to score really well. The obvious flag will be, in the next few weeks, I know Geelong have some tough opponents in terms of ruckman. I know Max Gawn isn't far away. It's going to be interesting to see if Geelong continue with this or if they bring Reece Stanley in for those games. And then obviously once Toby Conway's fit, I still think he's the one they want. But in the short to medium term, I think De Koning with his defender status is a great player to have. In the same game, we saw Nathan O'Driscoll for Fremantle. I don't know, I could be wrong on this. I always thought he was more of a wing outside type, but on the weekend, he had much more CBAs than I was expecting. After Brayshaw and Sarong, he was the Freo mid with the most, followed by Matthew Johnson. He scored well as a result. I don't know how long-term this is going to be. I think once Hayden Young returns to the side, which is still a few weeks away, he'll probably take that spot away from O'Driscoll, and we'll see him more on the wing, where he does score fine. But that just took me by surprise, the CBAs for him on the weekend. Another one from the same game, so there were a few in this Geelong Freo game that caught my eye. A guy that we've been expecting to go forward for a long time, and that's Paddy Dangerfield. Now, he didn't score all that well, but I saw something in him as a forward this week that I haven't seen in previous years where he's gone and rested forward. But his defensive pressure on keeping the ball in the 50 was really impressive, certainly early in the game when I was watching. And it sort of makes sense, doesn't it? Like, he obviously is getting older and he doesn't necessarily have the engine to get around the whole ground as well as he used to. But that burst of pace that he has and his ferocious attack on the ball, that's actually a really good weapon for Geelong to have in their forward half as a way to lock the ball in. I mean, imagine you're a defender trying to get out of D50, you got Paddy Dangerfield chasing you down. It'd be pretty nerve-wracking. So he kicked a couple of goals, didn't really shoot the lights out in a scoring sense, but I don't know, I think that DPP forward status is coming his way, and I think you could do a lot worse than having Dangerfield sitting in your forward line. I think he's going to be like a Sean Burgoyne was in his later years at Hawthorn, playing forward, but when Geelong really needs some experience in the middle and they need the next centre clearance, we might see him pop in there, and that'll be great for his scoring. So if he's kicking goals and getting 20 touches a game, I think he'll be pretty good. Jared Berry is a guy that is synonymous in the drafting world of potential, big scores, pick him up off the waiver wires, and then he drops a 40. Very frustrating, hard to know any change with him, whether it'll be short-term, long-term, or worth paying attention to. But on the weekend, against the Swans, we saw him go from the wing in the second half and sort of swap with Zorko to half back. Then Zorko went on the wing. I like this for Berry. He is a ball magnet in the right role, and if he continues in that role off half back, he scored 60 points in the second half, which he can do up the ground. He can score. But if he's off half back, picks up defender status, he could be a real game changer in some leagues. So definitely keep an eye on him this week. Curious to see what his role will be. Now, before I talk about this next guy, I want to shout out at Ryan Waters 1 on X, who mentioned this guy in the preseason and noticed he wasn't in my top 25 defender rankings and thought he'd pop up after round 1 and remind me of that. So that was Joel Freyer for the Bulldogs. I guess the reason I wasn't that bullish on him was just that he's a second-year player. He's only 19, and I didn't really see him having too much of an impact this year, but in the pre-season he looked good. He looks good off half-back, and that seems to be where the Bulldogs are playing him. But then something pretty unexpected happened on the weekend. Against North Melbourne, he started at half-back, but then moved into the midfield in the second half, much to the chagrin of Riley Sanders owners across all formats. So with Freya in the midfield, he scored 73 points in the second half. Huge. I don't really know if that's going to continue. I know that the Bulldogs obviously have guys like Treloar, Bontempelli a bit after that to come back in. And at the moment, Freya, I think I saw he was in the ruck at times, which, so I don't know. It sounds like they like this kid everywhere. But he scored really well. He has defender status. So if he becomes a permanent CBA mid, he's going to be really hot property. I don't think he will. I think he still finds his home at halfback and still scores really well. But that certainly was interesting on the weekend. The next guy I'll talk about, I won't go into great detail because we've actually got a listener question about this guy that I'll go through later. But Ned Long for Collingwood had a really big spike in his CBAs this week. Last week he came on as a sub and had a taste of it and looked good, but this week he was one of their main midfielders. So it seemed to come at the expense of Pendlebury, who was the sub. He seemed to take the CBAs that were left behind by Pendlebury being off. But what's really promising is when Pendlebury came on in the last quarter, Long's CBAs continued, and he still was pretty much one of their main mids. So I think it's... Actually, no, I'll talk about him at the end because I'll go into greater detail. But I just thought that was interesting, and he scored really well. Another guy in the same game, Collingwood Port Adelaide. I was at this game, and I tell you what, it was the hottest game I've ever been to. I don't mean the contest or the footy. I just mean Melbourne weather was pretty extreme, and it was sweltering. But as much as I complain, I wasn't over at Marvel across town where the roof was on, so that would have been even worse. Anyway, Port Adelaide, Jeremy Finlayson. Now, we saw in the pre-season game Finlayson taking on a new role in the back line, not necessarily as a loose or anything, but definitely a distributor, and he was one of many who feasted in that game against St Kilda in the pre-season. And I think a lot of us thought, well, it seems unlikely he'll have that role or score really well in that role in the season proper. But hey, he had the role on the weekend in the back line. He had a really big first half and then scored, pretty poorly in the second half. But he took 10 marks, so they're using him. Does it last? I don't know. But I'll be watching him this weekend against Richmond and see how he looks, because he's got forward status. I don't think many would own him, and he could be really handy for sides contending this year. The next one is Rowan Marshall and the ruck setup at St Kilda. So obviously Marshall, number one scoring player last year, absolute superstar. And then in January, just before the season, St Kilda brought in 26-year-old Harry Boyd from the Sandful, who had, I believe he won the Magarey medal last year as the best and fairest in the Sandful. And I think when that happened, Rowan Marshall owners would have noticed. I don't think they were too stressed. But I do remember at the time thinking, it's an interesting pickup. And I wonder if we see Marshall move forward a bit more this year. Look, that and the injury that Marshall had meant that there was a good chance this was going to happen early in the season, but I don't think anyone expected it to be so drastic. On the weekend, Harry Boyd was their number one ruck and Rowan Marshall played deep forward. Marshall took 5 CBAs and Boyd took 30. So, yeah, it's hard to know what to make of it because obviously Marshall had that interrupted pre-season, was always going to be nursed into the season. But, yeah, I don't know. It was quite weird to watch. And the other thing is Marshall came off at the end of the game and had ice on his knee, so we might not even see him back for a few weeks anyway. How do you look at it as a Marshall owner? Is this, a disaster? Your number one man's potentially losing his number one spot, or your number one man is about to gain forward status? Who knows? We'll see in the next month or so how it pans out, but very interesting times ahead. And the last one I've got on my list for the role changes for round 1 was Steve Cornelio at GWS. And we saw a bit of this in opening round, and it continued this week. He's actually attended 0 CBAs across the opening 2 games the Giants have played, and he is just playing forward now. His scoring has taken a big hit, but with forward status incoming in round 6, I think he's going to be pretty relevant. And, the year has only begun. We may see a shift later in the year if Giants get an injury or something changes and he goes back into the midfield with that forward status. Happy days. So they're the role changes I noticed in round 1. I'm not expecting that segment to be as long across the season. I just think there was a lot to take in because it's our first look at pretty much all the sides except for 4 who played opening round. If there's any I missed or you don't think any of those are gonna stick, let me know what you think about them, because I am only going off the games I could watch and then the numbers, which doesn't always give you the best indication. Let's go on to our waiver wire pickups. So I'm going to give you my top 10 for the week. I don't know if I'm going to do 10 every week. I thought about maybe doing it by position. I'm not sure. So this is how I'm doing it this week. It may change next week. Hopefully I can help you though. Number 1, Jack Ross at Richmond. Spoke about him on the midfielder rankings episode in pre-season. Just about how he's not a kid anymore, and in a side that is now very much full of youth, he's one of the more experienced guys at 24 years of age. But he absolutely stepped up and played a career game. I've seen him play like that a couple of times before. There was a game last year where I thought, geez, this guy does have something in him. But, due to injuries and whatever it may be, he just hasn't quite broken out. But if last week is any indication, he's about to break out and then some this year for the Tigers. Number 2, and it's a similar story, Mitch Nevitt at Geelong. He's a couple of years younger, certainly hasn't played anywhere as many games as Ross, but looked like in pre-season he was going to get his opportunity, and he absolutely did on the weekend. Scored really well, laid a heap of tackles, had plenty of CBAs, and I think there's a real new look to Geelong this year. Obviously, Bailey Smith comes in and has an instant impact, but I think they've got a lot of young guys that are going to step up this year, and they just always seem to do it, Geelong. They just rebuild and refresh on the run. I mean, they won a flag, missed finals for 1 year, and then back into a prelim, and now with this side full of young talent. Brilliant. Geelong fans would be very excited. Number 3, Jared Berry. He's a bit of a fool me once, shame on someone. I don't know how that saying goes. Basically, I think we've all picked Jared Berry up before as a free agent or as a waiver wire pickup, and it's pretty much always ended with us then throwing him back to the scrap heap. But the reason I've got him up there at number 3 for this week is, I talked about his role change and the fact that he played off half-back. It just makes me very interested in him if that's going to continue, not only for the scoring, the consistent scoring, because he can score high, but it's up and down playing as a winger. But off half-back, it's going to be more consistent, and then you're going to get the defender status. I'm very interested. Now, speaking of defenders, at number 4, I have Jake Bowie from Melbourne. There was a fair bit of talk about this guy a couple of years ago, and it never really took off for him, certainly in a fantasy sense. But with Stephen May out for, 3-4 weeks, I think it was, with a fractured larynx, does not sound nice. There's a real gap for the kick-ins because Stephen May is a huge kick-in guy for the Ds. And on the weekend, we saw Bowie pick up a few, and he scored pretty well. So I'd be more than happy to take a punt on him. Number 5, Nathan O'Driscoll for Freo. Another one of those young mids with a bit of opportunity could pop. As I said earlier, I don't think that he's going to be on the inside as much as he was last week, especially when Hayden Young returns. But he's certainly got great scoring pedigree even on the outside on a wing. So if he plays every game this year, I think he's going to average quite nicely. Number 6 is Harry Boyd, the young, well, he's not young, is he? The new St Kilda ruck. Look, he only scored in the 60s on the weekend, but that was his debut, his first ever game. And I think if Marshall's out injured, which I don't know anything about at this stage, I just know that he had ice on his knee, then potentially Harry Boyd has the spot to himself. And this is a guy that averaged 116 in the sample last year for Norwood. So, yeah, whilst he didn't score all that well on the weekend, I wouldn't be surprised to see him become quite popular as the weeks go on. So grab him now. Number 7 is Ned Long, young Collingwood mid who's starting to get a real spike in his CBAs and scored really well in the weekend, albeit in a big win over Port Adelaide, but certainly a guy for the future that could be starting to really show what he's got, and he's the sort of guy I like to grab now. Number 8 is Joel Jeffrey, playing off of half-back. He's had a good couple of weeks, including opening round. He's just still so young. I guess I'm just surprised that I'm having this conversation about him because Gold Coast have just got so many names that they run off half-back, and they recruited Rioli and Noble in the off-season. So I wasn't really expecting this from Jeffrey, but he's looking pretty good. Number 9, Thompson Dow for Richmond, another very young midfielder who's finally starting to show a bit. He was fantastic on the weekend, as was all those young Richmond guys. Laid a heap of tackles, had plenty of time in the midfield, and he's just a guy, I think he's been on our radar for a few years now, waiting to see a sign. Well, I'm telling you now, last Thursday night was the sign. And then lucky last, number 10, Jeremy Finlayson. Had to get him in there because I didn't have a forward. And as I mentioned earlier in the pod, in the role changes, it looks like he's playing in the back line and being used as a bit of a distributor. So grab him now, but yeah, I don't know. Maybe loop him, have another look at him against Richmond this week. But if you're contending this year and you've got a forward averaging 70, 75, it's pretty good business. And that is my top 10 waiver picks for this week. I'm not sure if I'll do 10 every week. I just think there's so many because it's round 1. Maybe we'll do 5 next week. See how we go. On to the last segment for this episode of Finders Keepers, and that is trade talk and your questions. Last week I asked you, the listener, to send me any trades that you've had in the past that you've regretted, you've loved, have won you a premiership, whatever it may be. And I had so much fun with it. Thank you again for those that put their trades in. Yeah, I had so much fun. I think we do that every week. I think that would be really cool. And it can be like, if you're considering putting a trade offer to someone in your league, you're not sure if you're paying overs, or someone's made an offer to you and you're umming and ahhing, send it through. You can remain anonymous if you like, in case those in your league might be listening. And I'll go through it on the pod every week and, give you my thoughts on what I think. And then, similar to most podcasts, any questions you've got around keeper leagues, dynasty leagues, send them through as well, and I'll read them out and give you my thoughts on those as well. All right, so this week we do have some questions that have come in. Let's go through them now. The first one comes from Hawker, so at Hawker's Heroes, has written in and said, early days obviously, but it looks like we streamed the same positions against the same teams as last year. It's very early for that to be an assertion, but I don't know. I've never been big on the soft or hard opposition teams, specific to positions, being something that carries on from year to year. I just think sides change so much. It may be the case, Hawker, but yeah, certainly way too early for us to think that. James from @JamesPlaysFS. What do you think of Ned Long in a Collingwood midfield that needs youth? And it's a great question. I spoke about Long in the role changes. I spoke about him as a waiver wire pickup suggestion from myself. So I think that probably answers your question. I think what's going on there is really good for Collingwood. Obviously, they are a side that is very experienced, very old, and clearly trying to get another premiership. And obviously the risk in that is you don't develop your youth, so that when all those older guys retire or, decline in their output, the whole side can fall off a cliff, and we've seen it in the past. So the fact that they appear to be getting game time and midfield time into this guy is a good sign. And I think the way he performed is a good sign as well. Obviously scored really nice on the weekend. As I said in the waiver pickup, I think he's worth grabbing. I love getting a guy just before it's obvious that he's going to pop. And things could change at Collingwood. He could find himself back in the forward line or back in the VFL, but no, I don't know. I think it's time one of these young Collingwood mids stood up, and I think he's going to do it. At Nicholas Davis 86 asks, who do you like out of Trainer and Bice? Long term, but with an eye for field ability this season too. Great question. Both arrived in the draft, the national draft last year. Trainer is an 18-year-old, but Bice is mature age. He's actually 24. Really good question. I find them hard to split. So Trainer, I think, in terms of job security, is in a better position, but I really liked what I saw from Bice on the weekend. He came on as the sub, I think just before three-quarter time, scored really well and picked up some kick-ins, and just appeared to be another one of those rebounding guys for the Swans. Hard to split them, but I think I'd probably land on Bice for now, just because I think his scoring could be better sooner. Long term, I think Trainer will be a really important player for Richmond, but just by a freckle, I'd have Bice. At Scott Cairns, this is a trade question. Excellent. At Scott Cairns says, Tiger tragic here. A league rival owns Lawler. How hard should I go to try and get him? I was thinking of offering my first pick this year, which was Travalia, and my future first rounder. I know this is probably overs, but owning Lawler would dramatically improve my quality of life. I know how that feels. So I'm a massive Crows fan, and I wasn't able to get Sid Draper in any of the drafts this year, but I've since pulled off a trade that's landed him to me. And I guess from that experience, I'd say, pay overs to get him in. I mean, Travalia is going to be great eventually, and, future first round is pretty high. 2 players for one, but I just think what we saw from Lawler on Thursday night was so exciting. Yeah, the scoring might not be elite for the first few years of his career, but he could follow a similar path to, everyone's made the comparison to Dusty, so I will as well. He was a guy that took a long time to become a really good fantasy scorer, but I think you have a go at it. Travaglia and a first round, I don't know, maybe try something a little different first. Don't go all in. Maybe try a future third, potentially. I do think Travaglia is going to be the better fantasy scorer over his career. But if you're a big Tiger fan and it would improve the quality of life, I don't know. Sometimes the game it's always about winning and building the best side. But this game is also about enjoyment. And if Lawler goes on to be your favourite Tiger, having him in your keeper league is going to be pretty enjoyable too. So I reckon go for it. Last question we've got from the Draft Bible. For the long-term Marshall owners, what are the next steps? Play a pool for a ruck and wait for forward status? I guess we're just going to wait and see, but I think first things first, and I probably should have said this when I was going through my waiver wire pickups, when I mentioned Harry Boyd as one of them. If you are a Rowan Marshall owner, Harry Boyd should be your absolute number one target on the waiver wire this week, for obvious reasons. I think if you pick up Boyd and Marshall ends up with forward status, you're going to be pretty happy either way. I guess another way to answer the question in terms of what are the next steps would be just don't panic. Don't try and trade him. Don't freak out. Let's just wait and see what happens. He's obviously got this injury, Marshall. They want him to play a bit more forward. We get that. But Max King should return for St Kilda at some point. And, if they can develop their forward line without needing Marshall, then it's going to work out just fine. So thank you for those that sent in the questions. Some good ones there. Keep sending them my way and you can have them read out on the podcast next week. Alrighty. Big breath, everyone. Round 1 is done. We're going to now start to see the beginnings of trends, changes, and how the season is going to unfold across the next few weeks. But that's it for this week on Finders Keepers, our round 1 review. I hope you've enjoyed it. Really hope you enjoyed the pre-season content that we brought you as well. I hope it helped you in your redrafts and preparing for season 2025, which is now well and truly underway. If you're enjoying the podcast so far, please give us a like and subscribe wherever you're listening. And if you are on X, come and give us a follow on @FindKeepAFL to stay up to date with everything that's going on with the podcast. And of course, to leave any feedback you have and send your questions in. All right, that's it for the week. Good luck with your waiver wire pickups. I hope you get the one you want. And good luck in round 2, kicking off this Thursday night with Carlton and Hawthorn. And then I'll be back on Tuesday with the next episode of Finders Keepers reviewing the round that was. In the meantime, I'm Jordox. This has been Finders Keepers. And until next time, keep on keeping on.